Kia ora, talofa. I'm Bronwyn Hayward, the author of the book, the School Strike edition of Children's Citizenship and Environment, which we are really pleased to be launching today. I'm even more delighted that we can be joined by some really wonderful activists, researchers and teacher educators who have been involved in writing exemplars and expanding the ideas from the original first edition to think about how we can support young citizens and school strikers in a changing climate. So tonight, we're going to hear from first a group of really terrific activists who've been working in the climate movement for quite a while now, and then some researchers thinking about how to support young people and teacher educators about how to support parents and teachers as we do our mahi or our work. So we'll hear from Maya Sutherland, who might wave her hand madly, who's the founder of the school strike, one of the founders of the school strike movement here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then from Kera Sherwood-O'Regan, who is, as well as being wonderful, she's described as an Indigenous kaitahu, queer, disabled, multidisciplinary storyteller. She's the co-founder of the story organisation Activate, and she's been working on sovereignty for oppressed peoples and on issues for Indigenous and disabled communities for over the last decade. And then Josiah Tualamali'I, Josiah has been the co-founder of Pilot, which is the Pacific Youth Leaders Transformation Organisation, and he started that 10 years ago when he was 14. He was one of the co-founders. And Sara Thomas, kia ora Sara, with the beautiful kowhai flowers behind you, who, as a law student, took the New Zealand government to court and is now a law graduate, a mum, and a city councillor. So a lot's happened in a year. And the researchers who have been thinking about how to support young people that we have with us tonight, amongst several who have written for the book, include Kate Prendergast, who's been working here as the manager for the Hei Puwaitanga Research Group and our manager of our Children in Cities program, but she works on youth anxiety and the issues for young people facing a changing climate. Mehedi Hasan, Mehedi's here from Dhaka, Bangladesh, where he's a planner and lecturer, but he's been working on how to support youth in the global south. Dr. Sylvia Nissen from Lincoln University, a senior lecturer there, where her award-winning work has been looking at how to support young people in a period of debt as they engage in activism. And then finally, in the hour that we've got together, we turn our attention to hear from Associate Professor Sara Tolbert, who's a researcher and educator and expert on environmental education and environmental justice. And Jocelyn Papprill, who we are delighted has been able to join us, who is leading an innovative Enviro Schools program here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and works in teaching beyond the classroom in the field. So just very briefly before we begin, I wanted to say when I first began the work on environmental citizenship, I was thinking about if our footprint is our impact that we've had on the environment, what's our social handprint? What's the kind of social change and positive effect we can make on our community? And I began interviewing with a group of researchers, children in the communities that we grew up with. And what was very striking in those studies was that there were three kinds of ways in which young people and also adults, I think, see their citizenship. One is what I would call a fears model, and this was before the age of Trump when we first started writing about it, but has become even more marked. It's students and young people, but also adults, who don't feel that they have the rights of citizenship, the ability to participate, to belong, to be heard. So they feel frustrated agency. They're environmentally excluded, whether we're building walls, excluding people from due to costs or due to racism, they're feeling shut out from their communities. And in that condition, what is often appealing is a kind of authoritarianism for decision making. You look for strong leaders who will make your situation better. And a kind of retributive justice goes with this too, a sort of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or at least someone to blame for the situation that you're in. And in this pathology of citizenship, we used to think that one of the things that was quite striking was that people's imagination, young people's imagination in particular, was quite silenced. But in the decades since we've written the first edition of the book, one of the remarkable changes has been that political imagination has now become hooked around ideas of conspiracy, ideas of disinformation that will somehow make sense of the very difficult position that you find yourself in. Luckily, not everybody shares this kind of pathology of citizenship, but I think it's important that we think about how we tackle that. The two other dominant models of citizenship that we discovered when we were just interviewing and talking to young people were first the really common, what I call the SMART model of environmentalism, where young citizens encouraged to see themselves as self-helpers, people who can take responsibility and make a difference in their community. And where they participate, particularly as citizens, is in the market. Shopping ethically, developing ethical products. If you can't shop ethically, at least shop till you drop, and keep the economy going. Their sense of justice is developed around rules as ideas of a priori or a contract justice. I will do my bit if you do your bit. It's a sense of a contractual expectation. There's an emphasis in this model of citizenship on representative decision-making. We expect people to vote and to be very good citizens turning out to vote. And the way that you express your citizenship is through a technological or technocratic imagination, inventing electric cars, solar power, new forms of energy, carbon capture and storage, new ethical products. Now, there's nothing wrong with this SMART model of citizenship. We desperately need individuals who can care. We desperately need new technological developments. But there are two really key problems that make this quite a thin form of citizenship. First, it puts enormous responsibility on the individual, facing what we know are really exceptional long-term environmental and social crises that we face now at a multiple level. And secondly, it doesn't ask or encourage students and young people to think about what are the social and economic and historical drivers of the climate injustices that we see around us. How do we actually fix the problem rather than just the symptoms, the carbon problems that we see? So the third model, the one that I'm personally most passionate about, is a seeds model of ecological citizenship, which I think echoes quite closely with Indigenous thinking about how to be in a community and belong. It emphasizes social action or social agency. Taking action with others is what you expect and hope and anticipate doing. Environmental education, which is grounded not only in environmental science and knowledge, which is deeply important, but also in a sense of place, a tūrangawaewae or a manatu, a place to stand, where you really understand and feel connected to your environment. You also develop a sense of embedded justice, what Amartya Sen calls, how to deal with the messy problems we see around us. Not everything can be fixed by a prior set up contract. We often find ourselves in difficult situations where we have to figure out what is fair and just. And alongside this is a sense of the ability to participate democratically, not just through voting, but also through deliberation, a decentered kind of deliberation, which is why we're really grateful that you've joined us tonight, because it's the discussions that are beyond our local communities with other people. And finally, a kind of political imagination that transcends yourself, because these problems are enormous. You need some way that can sustain you, whether it is the strength that you've drawn from ancestors over generations who've affected change, whether it's a spiritual strength, whether it's the strength and enjoyment of the environment or your colleagues or your friends around you. There is a real need for something to sustain change over time. So those were the ideas that we began with in both of the books and looking at, but what has been wonderful is to see how these have been expanded in different ways and in practice through those who are working right at the front of the climate crisis that we face. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Maya Sutherland, who was, as I say, one of the co-founders And I've asked Maya, would you mind talking a little bit about the issues that you think people need to think about to support school strikers now and into the future? We hear an enormous pressure on young people will save us, and I personally worry about that enormously. But what are your thoughts, Maya, from having set up and actually led some of these major protests?
Yeah, kia ora. Thanks for having me here, Bronwyn. It's really nice to have been able to contribute. So that's really special. I just want to say thank you so much. And yeah, I thought about this question for a while because I guess being sort of like an activist, even though I don't really like that word, it's so like intense, and you're so caught up in the moment that you often don't stop to think sort of, what do I need, or who can help me right now. And that's the sentiment that a couple of young people I talked to about this topic sort of confirmed, that this was not just me feeling like this. So I sort of tried to think about what people did that made me feel like my cause and my actions were all sort of worth it. And surprisingly, it's the exact same thing that we're all calling for, and that's action, because it just shows that people not only believe in what you're doing in just for the sake of it, but just them changing what they do and making an effort to show that they believe in what we're doing through their actions just makes it so much easier to carry on. It's that affirmation that we're doing something good for the planet and good for people. And it's also nice to hear not just empty words, because when you're working with so many different people, you often hear a lot of empty words of, yes, we're going to do that, or yes, we're trying to do this. And so when you actually see some action, especially when you're advocating for action on a systemic level, when you see just individuals changing the way that they go about their lives, or groups or businesses, or even local central government, it really does make a big difference to our attitudes and how we keep on doing what we do. Yeah, so that's sort of what I thought of. A couple of other things that some of the students had talked about was just moral support, just checking in, seeing what people need and when they need it. And yeah, that's what we came up with.
Thank you so much, Maya. And I suppose, Kera, needing more than words has been something that's been so important for Indigenous communities and disability communities, but particularly the Indigenous communities who have led this battle for decades and decades now. And what are your thoughts, coming from your background, about building from Maya's comments about what it is that we really need to do if we're going to be really serious about supporting the objectives that are being set down by young school strikers?
Yeah, kia ora, Bronwyn. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you so much for having me as well. Similar to Maya, I've been absolutely thrilled to be part of this kaupapa and to be invited to contribute to the book and to be able to speak today. I guess I firstly, when I'm answering a question like this, I like to sort of ground my experience in multiple identities, being an Indigenous and also a disabled and queer wahine as well. And I think a lot about the wisdom that comes from our communities. And I guess that really comes down to really recognizing that, if we really want to tackle this climate change problem, and if we want to move beyond those, nice words and into that real action, that Maya was talking about, I think we really need to recognize that this involves a lot of dismantling. We have to dismantle a lot of climate harming and extractive industries. We need to be exploring, how do we change our political system that currently keeps people who most need to be heard in decision making and who are most affected by climate change completely out of the picture in so many cases. But I think that also tackling climate change not only requires this sort of dismantlement of these harmful and oppressive and, climate change causing systems, but also reimagining different ways of being, moving, connecting, working, so that we can generate a much more positive, inclusive and sustainable system that protects our people, our communities and our whole planet. And I think, when I consider these sorts of questions, I see that nobody is in a better position to lead that sort of reimagining than the communities that are already on the front lines of climate change. Nobody knows our communities better than we do. Nobody is better positioned to advocate for our rights and to understand how that connects with, our environment and with the climate as a whole. So I really see representation as being a really important part of that, but it is just sort of one step. We want to be directly included and represented in the decision making on climate issues and within the movements, like the school strike movement and, across the board, really, we want to see, our diverse communities represented, but we don't just want to be there to say, hi, we showed up. We want to be there to really be able to transform the way that we're thinking about climate action, because the way that we've been thinking about it so far has been very tied into these sorts of capitalist and oppressive systems, I think, which have been causing climate change in the first place. So, I guess with that sort of reflection, I know yesterday we spoke about, maybe having a couple of, like my 5-point plan, or, what are the sorts of actions that I think our communities would really like to see in order to be able to show up and take that action to the next level. So if it's all right, I have a couple of points that I prepared earlier. So a couple of things that I've really been thinking around is how can people be accomplices and allies for climate justice, looking at climate justice and climate action that centres voices of communities who experience climate change first and worst, whose worldviews and knowledge systems have often been oppressed and excluded, and very often delegitimised in our mainstream sort of understanding of climate change. So I think the first way that people can really support this truly inclusive and climate just sort of action is firstly to sit with any discomfort that comes, when you're learning about oppression for the first time. Of course, that's going to be uncomfortable. You might recognise that you have privilege that you didn't realise that you had, or that you might, even myself, I've recognised, I've actually been guilty of perpetuating a type of oppression myself. And I think it's natural to want to jump to this action point. But sometimes if we jump to that point without critically reflecting on what is the discomfort, where is that coming from, then we can be led to, continue these sorts of climate actions, which are just reinforcing more of the status quo, and which, while well-intentioned, might not always have a positive impact for our communities. And so the second thing, I think, is listen to a really diverse range of disabled, Indigenous, migrant, people of colour, to our voices, and particularly pay attention to those ones that might, make you a little bit uncomfortable, might make you challenge some of your existing thoughts around climate change and how that works or what kind of action is appropriate. I think thirdly is, recruit people to your movements, but do so in a way that is inclusive and without tokenism, because so often our communities are reduced to these sort of one-dimensional stereotypes, and that can be, a real pathway to sort of, have your token disabled person who talks about accessibility issues, but maybe doesn't get to shape the whole discourse or the whole action plan that you're taking. So I'd really encourage people, if you're wanting to be an ally for climate justice, then really hold space for us to be ourselves, not just as an organisational token. Second to last is just accessibility. Make all of your content, your campaigns, your events accessible, and do that as a minimum requirement, not just when you recognise, someone who's obviously disabled is showing up, because for many of us, our disabilities are invisible, or the requirements that we might have culturally, you might not be aware of from the surface. So just try to make those spaces inclusive and accessible to our communities as the sort of minimum bar. So whether that's your marches, whether that's your, sort of planning meetings, and whether that's even your language that you use when you're talking about climate change. So, avoiding a lot of, I think, language and metaphors that are based on disability, like, talking about crippling or paralyzing. It's used a lot in sort of activist and climate activist discourse, but can be a sort of subtle signal to our community that maybe we're not welcome in those spaces. And very, very last, saving the hardest for last, I would really encourage people, if they can, to think about redistributing your power and resources. So if you want to be an accomplice to anti-ableism, anti-racism within the climate movement, then think about the resources that you have access to, whether that's a platform that you have on social media or whether that is funds. Try and channel that to other people. And of course, read the book. There's some more in there. But yeah, so those are my sorts of suggestions initially. So thanks so much for having me and enabling me to kōrero on this with you.
Kia ora, Kera. Thank you so much. And I should say this is perhaps a good moment to do a commercial advertisement, which is to say that if you do buy the book, borrow it from a library is always more sustainable. But if you're buying it, the author royalties are all going to Te Ara Whatu, the Indigenous Pacific Māori activist group here in Aotearoa, Pilot, the Pacific Youth Leadership Trust, and the School Strikes for Climate. So you're supporting really good causes at a practical level. But thank you, Kera. So Josiah, you've been thinking a lot about how to affect change for Pacific youth here in Aotearoa and around the realm and region. What are your thoughts about, we often hear this very stark use of, I don't want to say climate porn, but you get this kind of ongoing, really extreme stuff in which Pacific communities are portrayed as victims. It is extremely serious in the Pacific. But how do you respond in terms of ways to actually practically help and support Pacific voices and elevate those narratives, those ways of seeing the world?
Whakatae, Bron, malo lava e so for everyone. Oloingo Josiah Tualamali'I, as has been said. I'm Josiah, and this is us from Pilot. But we, as Bron has said, try and empower Pacific young people's voices here in Ototahi and throughout New Zealand, and we've had the privilege at times to be through the Pacific. But to address your question, as Pacific communities, whether we're still living in our Indigenous place and space, or we have the islands in our minds and our hearts, and we're somewhere else, our ways of being are not lost, and often they've been the things that have given us hope through colonization and through the many different, in another article that you helped lead the writing of, Ronnie, and please, we might put it in I'll put it in the chat after I finish so people can have a look. We wrote about how for Pacific communities, the experience of slavery, of loss of language and land through colonization of our countries, through the ongoing colonization that still happens. And New Zealand still has a dependent state, aka a country that we're colonial rulers of, Tokelau. And so some of these choices could mean that we are very hopeless peoples. And so connecting it back to what you've asked about climate change, we have always found a way. And I suppose some of the Extinction Rebellion and other discourse that we have to completely turn up the world, or we might have to hold people, physically stop people from living their lives, be in a despair mentality, activate emergencies, is not how we in Indigenous communities, it's not how we in the Pacific have responded to these things. Our approach always has been about the collective. It's been about our villages. It's been about our kaumatua, our elders and our young people, and every person and having a place, space, and a way to participate. And so I suppose if I was to bring one thing into this that I'd really like us to centre in these conversations going forward, is the hope that Indigenous communities have despite the extreme trauma that we've been through, and the way we approach things. Like I work in mental health, and so one of the things often talked about is in the mental health context, we might say mental health, but in Pacific, we don't have concept of mental health. we have the concept of being able to give and receive love. And if you can't give and receive love, that leads to blockages, which then makes you unwell. And so I suppose if we look at it through the context of love, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here globally, we're trying to be able to share the love for other humans so that they can exist and continue their culture, language, traditions, and heritage. I think we have a different approach that means that we're centering hope in this rather than despair. And so what we try to do with Pacific Youth here, when the conversations that we have and the submissions we write to decision makers and the activities we do, is to say that their voices are bringing that hope and that the systems can also be hopeful as a result of it. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're part of doing. And I suppose if I was to add one little hook for our country, it's probably that at the moment, some of our processes, aka we've had a number of decision makers abuse young people and children in various ways that have been quite well publicized in the last couple of years. And so those people are stealing the hope. And we need Parliament to act far more strongly around codes of conduct for members of Parliament and decision makers so that we have a safe space for children and young people to raise what's important to them. And so, yeah, whakatai everyone.
Thanks so much, Josiah. And that's a great way, coming back to our whole panel, of thinking about sometimes we really have to actually make really significant rules and decisions when and take real action. And Sara Thomson has been in the situation of forcing a High Court case where she took the government to court. Sara, do you think it is necessary that we have this kind of route when things go badly wrong, that we need to use the courts? Would you see that as a tool that we have to use more often? And if we do, how do we support people who are finding themselves in that situation?
Kia ora, thanks, Bronwyn. I think tool is the right word. There's no silver bullet, and there's lots of ways to approach the issue of climate change and to approach actually getting decision makers to make the right decisions. And so I think that litigation plays a really important role for a number of reasons. One is that it brings about a lot more awareness. So I think that was an important part of my own case, was actually bringing to light the inadequacy of New Zealand's targets to reduce emissions under the Paris Agreement. And it started a lot of public debate and discourse. So creating awareness is one thing, but then there's also actually forcing change. And when a court case, sometimes it might be that it highlights a deficiency. So you can see actually the court has said, you're not doing enough, go back and remake that decision or do more. That is really important. Or in some countries, it actually is forcing real action from governments. And it can depend a lot on the legal framework of a country. So our courts can't really force our government to take certain actions, but it can tell them to go back and remake a decision, taking things into account, as an example. So I think there's huge value in it. And I think at the moment, say in New Zealand, we're still kind of building on I guess each case is building on the case before it. And so one case may not actually get the result that you're looking for. Like in my own case, ultimately the judge didn't quite give the relief that we're looking for, but it did set a platform for another case to come, because it said the courts can look at climate change and make decisions around whether the government is doing enough to look after our people. And it said this is something that the courts can scrutinise. So that means that the next person that comes in to take a case can actually, I guess, not have to go through that battle of actually even, being able to confirm whether the court can even hear their case. So I think in terms of giving young people support in this area, there's four things I think which are critical to kind of make climate litigation possible. The first thing is you need the lawyers, and it seems obvious, but actually lawyers are really expensive if you're paying for them. So in my own case, the lawyers took the case fully, pro bono, so they didn't take any compensation for it. And there are lawyers out there who really do care about this issue, and I think would be willing to help young people to take litigation if that's the path they wanted to go down. But it is finding them and having that support is really important. And similarly for those lawyers, actually they can't take a case without a plaintiff. If they've got no one to put their hand up and to actually put their name to that case and take it, then they can't really take action either. So both are needed. The second thing is having support, actually, that strength, Bronwyn, you talked about, because all the way along people are going to be saying you're doing the wrong thing, you're wasting taxpayer money, or what, your case is bound to fail. It's you get a lot of criticism, and you shouldn't read staff comments, but having people that you respect or that you love around you saying actually keep going, like you are doing the right thing and you can do this, that's having that source of strength is really important. So a way to provide support is actually being kind of that I guess supporter or person who provides morale. And another thing is, of course, money. And even if you have lawyers taking your case, I think it is really important if you do see youth taking action to actually, if you are in the position to provide that support, to actually think of donating something, because we ended up raising $10,000 around about that on Give a Little, to actually just do the logistical stuff of getting down to Wellington, staying there for 3 nights, printing out I'm sorry for the trees, but 10,000 pages of documents to then kind of land on the judge's table. So, those are just really practical things that, ultimately you do have to pay for. And as a poor student, or, it's not always easy to have that money yourself. And the last thing was some people are naturals at this, but I got really nervous. Having to talk to media is actually quite scary. So a very practical thing is providing some support to people, around just practicing or knowing how to approach an interview. I remember on the day that I filed my case, even with all that kind of prep, I still ate very little, and what I did eat, didn't go down well. So it was very nerve-wracking. And once again, having that support when things don't go well and your interview flops or whatever it is always nice. So yeah, some practical things for assisting where youth decide that litigation is the path to take.
Kera, thank you, Sara. And I think you brush over modestly some really big issues, especially for young women who go online and in public, that, the trolling, the attacks, this is really difficult. We've seen Greta elevated to great heights, but there are many, many young activists, Indigenous women, queer, disabled, as Kera's saying. Maya's experienced an enormous amount of just the trolling. It takes a toll, and its aim is to silence. So also that kind of affirming support is really vital.
Absolutely.
Now, so thank you for your work. We also, I should have said at the beginning, for those people who are putting in really interesting questions, we'll open it up at the end just after 8 for a Q&A. But so we'll go through your questions. So yes, please do put questions in. But if I could turn to some of the research team, and there are several researchers who've written for the book, some who can't be here tonight. But we're grateful to have Dr. Kate Prendergast with us, because one of the other burdens, Kate, that a lot of young activists and older activists feel, especially around climate, is this sense of anxiety and emotional exhaustion. in your work around wellbeing, what's your reading and thinking about strategies for dealing with this and for supporting people in that situation?
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. It's lovely to be here and be able to talk in the panel tonight. And I would also just like to express a huge congratulations on your launch of the book. So you raise a really important issue, and I think the people that are attending tonight and all the panelists, we're all here because we are concerned about the changing climate. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that having a strong emotional response to climate change is completely natural and normal. And so people will feel a range of different emotions, both children and adults, ranging from anger to frustration, despair, hopelessness. And while it's normal to have these kinds of emotions, these emotions can be really difficult and challenging to cope with. And so I thought tonight I would just touch on 3 of the strategies that are often promoted and talked about in the research before concluding with what I think needs to happen longer term to support young people's wellbeing. And so the research shows that it's really important that we are able to facilitate conversations with young people about climate change. So it's important that we support them to talk about what's happening and about their feelings, but also to validate their feelings. So yeah, we need environments that encourage conversations about climate change. The second thing that we can do to support young people, particularly some of the younger children, is to find ways for them to take positive action around climate change. And sometimes some of these messages are criticised, but if as a household you, for example, use your car less or have meat-free days, or you find ways that your child or young person can join environmental organisations or groups, the research does show that this really empowers young people and gives them a sense that they are making a difference. And so supporting your young people, if that's what they want to do that is important. Another thing the literature shows is that we can help young people by promoting what we call constructive hope. So for some young people, taking these small actions to make positive change can be really overwhelming, especially if, for example, their peers aren't committed to making the same changes. Young people can feel an overwhelming burden or place an overwhelming burden on themselves. So speaking with young people and identifying some of the more global initiatives that are taking place to create, promote hope and optimism is important. So that could be by identifying, for example, groups or policy that is taking meaningful action around climate change. And so while those strategies have all been identified in the literature and they're really important for promoting individual wellbeing, I think it's already been talked about today. We need more transformational and longer term change to really support young people's wellbeing into the future. And so I think we need to be moving away from just these individual solutions to a place where we're engaging more collectively around climate issues. And so I'd just like to reflect on the climate protests that happened in 2018, is still happening today. And a lot of the narratives around the protests have been around what's mobilised young people to take part in these protests. So young people have been mobilised by feelings of anger and frustration. But what's often not captured, especially in the media and the popular discourse, is that the protests themselves have often become sites of joy and positivity, dancing and laughing. And I think some of these positive emotions that we experience as a result of collectively working together are really important. And so I'd just like to sum up with one final reflection, and that's if we really want to support young people's wellbeing in a changing climate long term, I think it's important that we look at ways that we can develop the skills and attributes in our young people so that they can work together and come together collectively to make transformational changes in society.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thanks also for all your work. And the reality of actually we also have to change the environment, make transformational change, and remarkably, well-being will improve is a really important thing to say. Mehedi Hasan, you have been working here in New Zealand on your PhD, but you are also a lecturer in Dhaka, and you've been thinking about these issues for the Global South. You've also been here during the terrible terror attacks last year, which coincided on the same day as Maya was organising and colleagues were organising the strike. Literally, these two colossal events collided in a way that I think, would you agree, Maya, we are all still working out here, that whole connection of racism and injustice and climate. And as somebody who had to support the community through that, it's been, I know, very difficult for you, and we're really grateful that you're here because you've been thinking about how to support children in the Global South as well as the Global North. Would you like to tell us a little bit about some of your research thinking?
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. I'm really honored to be here. I'm researching on environmental issues that impact youth in the Global South, as you said. And especially my country, Bangladesh, is facing challenges due to climate change. And as it says, that changing climate is very stressful for youth. And but I'm also interested in my PhD research. I have found that I need to tell about something about safe urban transport that has brought urban youth in Dhaka city to protest for sustainable transportation, and searching for more sustainable solutions. From my experience and understanding, I think access to green space is very essential for any kind of mental well-being and also relaxation and restoration. So, for example, from the previous you said about the Christchurch attack or anything else, Muslim communities are facing lots of trauma and stress, and I think green space can helpful for any kind of mental restoration or mental well-being, I think. Yeah.
And Mehedi, one of the interesting things that in Dhaka, I don't know if we can come back to a whole panel view for a minute, Kate, but one of the interesting things that has been significant in your research is that young people in Dhaka haven't rallied around climate change, but they have rallied around other key environmental issues. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was interesting because I said my country is facing lots of challenges, climate change, but they are not in the protest. Maybe they are not well circulated about the protest, or maybe they are not concerned about that. But they are well concerned about that other issues like public transport and other urban planning issues. So that was very interesting, but that was very connected to also climate change, I think, because of the pollution and other issues of connected to the transport issues. So their participation is different, but not really connected to climate change. That was interesting. Yeah.
Yes, and certainly thousands of young Bangladeshi students taking to the streets to protest about really poor and unsafe public transport, and basically reorganising public transport at the same time as their cohorts in other cities were taking to the streets about climate was a really fascinating situation. And also the retaliation later by the government, and which has been very difficult immediately, and then a mixed response later, reminds us that there's a lot at stake when young people go out on strike. So Sylvia, your work's been thinking about how vulnerable people are when they protest. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your thinking?
Yeah, Kami Himana, it's an absolute privilege to be here and to be part of this conversation. And yeah, so thank you again, Bronwyn, for bringing us together. So yeah, I would like to talk about student debt because that's something that my work has looked into a fair bit. And student debt is not often associated with political action or the climate strikes, but it has some really important implications. Because we have to remember that the school strikes are taking place at a time when many young people are facing significant economic and social insecurity and precarity. And that has many sources, but one of those does include, especially in the neoliberal democracies, the loss of many social protections over the last 30 years, and that one of those has been has resulted in the rise of student debt, which is at unprecedented levels. So there's sort of two main connections that I want to speak to here. And the first of it is about how when you think about the climate strikes through the lens of student debt, it's really a reminder that political action like the climate strikes is often despite considerable barriers. And my work has looked a lot at the particular demands that student debt can present in young lives, especially on young people's time and finance. And we also know that student debt has been linked to poor mental health, exhaustion and burnout. And so these demands can also result in a loss of social networks that are crucial for encouraging a sense of agency. So my big worry here is that the rise of student debt could make political engagement increasingly a luxury for some. But the other point I want to make is also that the experience of precarity has the potential to be a source of solidarity and experimentation, especially if those efforts to reduce insecurities are tied into alternative visions of a more ecologically sustainable system. And we also know that social movements feed from one to the other. And we know, for instance, that the student debt protests of 2011 and 2012 in Europe and parts of North America have had lasting legacies in forming activist networks and practices of resistance. So I think this is a really interesting area that hasn't been, and a connection that hasn't been fully explored yet, but I do think it's, yeah, it's a space of huge challenge, but also possibility.
Thanks so much, Sylvia, and thanks for your work. And I think it's a rich and important conversation to think about the way in which protest is driven from vulnerability. But from vulnerability, also there is this great sense of solidarity and risk and change. But these raise questions of environmental justice, and tackling these difficult issues is challenging for teachers in classrooms, where they are confronted with, or out in the field, as we'll hear shortly, where they're confronted with really difficult moral choices and difficult political issues. So I'm really grateful that we can be joined by Associate Professor Sara Tolbert, who's written two parts, one about teaching into the Anthropocene as environmental science research, and the other in the book about thinking about how to teach environmental justice and issues. So Sara, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This panel has just been phenomenal and I'm honored to be a part of it. So I appreciate being here. I think, as you mentioned, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to teaching about climate change. And I think one of them that is historical is the question of where does it sit and who's responsible for teaching it. And Bronwyn, you and I had been looking at that recent Ministry of Education report from 2019, He Whakaaro, How Environmentally Aware Are New Zealand Students? And that report found that New Zealand students said that they, or expressed both a low ability to explain causes of environmental problems and also low optimism in regard to those same environmental problems. I think we would all argue that these data don't mean students are apathetic by any means. New Zealand students reported schools as being the main source of information on environmental issues, with media as the second most common source. And I think these challenges aren't unique to New Zealand. Globally, climate change is often taught in ways that are depoliticized or lacking social and local context and connections. Climate change often sits, when it is taught, within science, where students learn the causes of climate change, but not how to engage as a citizen in climate change related ecological, social, and political issues. While it is important for students to learn about the science, how to mitigate the worst effects of climate change are social and political and not as much scientific challenges. We also know that awareness of environmental problems is not enough to affect individual behavioral or socio-political change. The process of understanding climate change as human-induced, which is important, has been a massive scientific, political, and educational effort. Yet part of that, despite how difficult it's been politically across the globe to achieve, I wonder how well that aligns with the idea that if humans have caused it, then changing our individual actions can solve it. And I worry about that being a neoliberal solution. And I think we have to be cautious about those messages, as Kate mentioned as well. Let's all just ride our bikes to work and school. Those are positive changes and important ones, but that's only one part of the story and one part of the solution. And also, and I think what I'm trying to say here about this is that not all humans have contributed to climate change equally, and not all humans are experiencing the most devastating effects from it. And we have to think about and teach about systemic causes and systemic changes while critically reflecting upon differences in our responsibilities in this wicked problem. So, in that respect, teaching about justice is essential to teaching about climate change. And as other panelists have mentioned, I think a big question is, how do we listen more radically to the voices of those most affected, particularly in how we imagine and move forward in our solutions? So in all of this complexity, what is good teaching when it comes to climate change if it's not just teaching about causes, or if it's not just raising awareness? Teachers also experience anxiety about climate change themselves, as well as how to teach it in empowering ways. And often this anxiety can lead to an avoidance or an oversimplification of the subject. These are important considerations. A student of mine recently expressed that she's convinced all of her generation has some form of climate depression, and teachers aren't immune to this. Just as children's ecological citizenship capabilities need to be nurtured, social agency, embedded justice, environmental education, deliberative democracy, self-transcendence, teachers' ecological citizenship capabilities for teaching also need nurturing. And we ask a lot of our teachers. So what does this look like in practice? How do teachers learn to teach about what they perceive as controversial or potentially anxiety-inducing wicked problems like climate change? I think a big part of this that we've been working on with pre-service teachers is we start where we are. Maybe that's on the school grounds or the nearby stream. Teachers and students alike need opportunities to learn about Mana Whenua and the local history, the urban or rural planning history, the colonial history of their place, while learning about the science, the ecology, kaitiakitanga, how to care for, how to restore, how to be a part of a collective working towards living well together, or in Professor Linda Tuilamali'i-Smith's words, how to be a good ancestor. The SEEDS model that you describe in this book, Bronwyn, is a powerful one for this type of praxis. We use it in our courses here at Te Whare Wananga o Waitaha in the School of Teacher Education, where we teach issues of sustainability as inseparable from issues of justice. So teachers use the SEEDS model to reflect and design activities in which they as kaiako learn to work alongside tamariki and whānau to ask critical and justice-oriented questions about local places and places that matter to children and their families, while connecting to global efforts as they relate to climate change and other pressing environmental issues. One pre-service teacher has her students do a rubbish survey where they live, and this pre-service teacher lives on a dairy farm. So she has students ask questions about why they, as rural families, don't have access to a recycling center. Another of the pre-service teachers wrote about a project in which she engages tamariki in questioning recent city council planning decisions that affect children, such as playground redesign, and how children's voices weren't part of that planning. And she wrote, each day we make decisions about the clothes we want to wear, the food we wish to eat, and the activities that we want to engage in. Some decisions are made in consultation with others who may be affected, for example, when cooking a family dinner. However, why does that allow people who are in authority to make decisions outside of our homes for us? Why should we not be involved in these decisions? Therefore, it is highly important to teach children to stand up and have their say. However, that they should also consult other people whom it may affect. Oscar Wilde and Dr. Seuss, as cited in Hayward, she wrote, this teacher, both write in their children's stories that effective deliberation about the environment requires more than talk. To make a difference, action must happen, and it is well known that if we collaborate and join forces with others, then actions can be made to a deeper level. So these may seem like small interventions that may not ultimately address the big problem of climate change head on, but they are learning experiences that cultivate care, empathy, self-transcendence, social agency, and political literacy. These are the skills and dispositions that we desperately need for taking on problems like climate change, yet they're so often marginalized in our curriculum. When teachers and students learn about problems while also taking part in tangible solutions, they become part of a collective of Earth's protectors, working in solidarity, learning and relearning what it means to live well together on a damaged planet.
Thank you so much, Sara. And there was so much in there about teaching, but that's also valuable for activists, for all of us really, and parents. The emphasis you've put on teaching in classrooms and how a lot of the most important issues are often pushed to the side was an issue that came up yesterday in another discussion panel we had, where we were talking about civics and citizenship education more generally here in Aotearoa. And these big questions of climate change, how we prepare citizens, are often too difficult in a curriculum where there is a lot of focus on testing and assessment. Jocelyn, you've done a lot of work on both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. So you've got the hard task of the final word is yours before we turn to the questions. But from your experience from field teaching and your experience of Enviro schools and the environment program, which has had to fight to be seen and visible in the curriculum, what are your messages about how to support the school strike generation, if we can use that overgeneralization in teaching?
Oh, thank you, Bronwyn. Tēnā koutou katoa. It is a privilege to be involved with this, and I've been nodding here as I've listened to all of you, but particularly Sara, because I think I need to have a conversation with you, Sara, particularly on how we develop the EFS standards for secondary school and the kind of research that's been done from the early 2000s. I mean, there's a sense of frustration from being an ex-secondary teacher. So it has been a real pleasure listening to all the rest of you. Bronwyn, I just want to correct you, I'm not an Enviro Schools person. Enviro Schools is not something I'm involved with. I'm very supportive of their co-popper. I'll come to what I am shortly. Sara, I'd love to have a conversation with you about the new Ministry of Education document and the wonderful thing they have in there, alongside the climate change learning document. There is the Wellbeing document as well, because they recognise, the writer Sian Cavell recognised fairly early on just how important it is to have the well-being side by side with the actual learning around climate change issues, because of the recognition of eco-anxiety, not only in our students but for teachers as well. But it does feel like it's been a very long time that I've been working in the space of providing opportunities for young people to engage with issues of importance within the environmental or sustainability realm, engaging with those wicked problems that have been mentioned before: climate change, biodiversity loss, freshwater management, social injustice, poverty. The list could go on. As a social science teacher, I was really frustrated that we never had the time to go deeper with particular issues, because we were constantly jumping through so-called NCA hoops. So I was really excited in 2003 to become involved with the Untouched World Foundation. And I don't know whether many of you have heard of the Untouched World Foundation, but you've probably heard of the clothing company Untouched World. Perry Drysdale created this foundation back in the early 2000s. It creates opportunities for young people throughout the country, senior secondary and tertiary students, to come together to develop their citizenship and leadership capabilities. These opportunities take the form of week-long experiential full immersion programs focused on a conservation issue or sustainability issue, such as the Blue Mine Restoration Program with DOC. The previous one that I used to facilitate was called Te Moana, No Such Place as Away, which was addressing waste and consumerism. And now there are 2 Waterwise programs currently operating, one in Canterbury, which I facilitate, and another one in Otago. They're very place-based, beyond school immersion activities like these provided by the Foundation provide opportunities that schools cannot. The young people who choose to attend these programs meet with other similarly motivated young people, and through them they feel less isolated, more empowered, and have time to delve deeply into an issue, as well as to explore ethical or philosophical ideas, some of those like social justice that Bronwyn and others of you have highlighted here. Anyway, since leaving the classroom teaching and taking up work as a youth engagement and education advisor at Environment Canterbury, our regional council, I've worked with colleagues to create a shorter version of this, a 2 to 3 day immersion, which we call the Youth Voices Noho Marae. And I've just seen that you've signed up, Maya. So excellent. Looking forward to having you on board with that. And these have been running since 2012, and they're generally focused on the resource management issues of current importance in the rohi in which we're staying. The young people involved get the opportunity also to learn something of Ngāi Tahu tikanga and history, which has been really important. But also the most important thing that they learn about Ngāi Tahu is that they are active in today's political space. So often at school, they hear about things Māori as though it's in the past, that they're not really playing an active role today. And what they really realise through these programs is that they sit at the decision-making table with our regional council and have a very important role to play. So it's this story about these programs that I've contributed to your Bronwyn's update of her book. So thank you very much, Bronwyn, for allowing me to put a piece in there. Essentially, using an environmental sustainability lens, we're looking to develop the young people's action competencies, their citizenship muscles, to influence long-term behaviour change. And I liked Kate's idea of constructive hope. It is absolutely vital to engender positivity, a sense that collectively we can make a difference. We have a lot of young people who come out of schools and they feel they're the only one who's interested in this. When they come together, they realise actually there are other young people who are desperate to want to make a difference, and so they can join together and collectively to make a difference. These programs expose the young people to a range of perspectives on the identified issues, and they learn about the political process, both the small political and the political with the big P, and the policies responses required to resolve them. But policy responses are not enough alone. So woven throughout each and every natural resource issue we address is the likely impacts of climate change. And if we don't address them, the young people call us out. They raise them because this is one of their greatest concerns. They quickly realise how complex many of these issues are, because often they come with ideas on, well, say water issues. Just take the cows off the Canterbury Plains. Well, it's not that easy. So there is a complexity that they really understand. They also realise that for collaborative decision making requires each of us to know ourselves. What values drive me? How do I absorb new information? What does listening to others really require of me? And what might be my bottom line in negotiating a pathway to resolution? Again, it's become quite clear that the young people we engage with are most concerned that governance at all levels is not working hard enough or making quick enough decisions relating to climate change. And these young people are ready to step up and take their place around those decision-making tables, but they don't want to be alone around those tables. So in summary, how can we support a school strike generation? I think this is a challenge that our regional council, in partnership with Ngāi Tahu and organisations like the Untouched World Foundation, has embraced already. We will continue to offer for young Cantabrians the opportunity to dive deeply into local environmental issues, because we want them to be inquiring, engaged citizens, the type of thing that's at the front end of the New Zealand curriculum document. We want them to be willing to work with others on difficult problems with an eye to the future. It's not easy work, but it's important. And each and every time we run a program, the feedback is, why don't we learn about these things in school? How come I never knew about Ngāi Tahu's history and their claim? Or now I know I can have a voice in creating a future I want to see. the thing that I want to emphasise that schools cannot provide this type of education alone. And to paraphrase a common saying, it takes a community to raise the next generation. So I want to leave it there.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. And I think also, flicking this round and coming to some questions from the panel, I think also the next generation is raising this one, which is one of the incredible frustrations, because there is much learning outside the classroom, as you say, in field work and field teaching, but also the activism itself, the projects that Maya's led, the work that Kera and Josiah has done, is that self-education of lifting a community. And when we look at the far-reaching change that needs to happen, it can be very overwhelming. So your comment about working, everybody's comments about working with others and that sense of ecological citizenship, I know that I found an enormous sense of personal support from my work on the IPCC, on the climate panels, because these are huge global issues. And unless you have a range of people around you who are working collectively, it is very overwhelming. But we're very grateful to the people who have stayed the distance to ask some questions on our launch. So Kate, I'm wondering if you'd mind just scanning the chat to pick up some of the questions that have come in. And I'm not sure whether viewers who are watching this will be able to see the whole panel, or just individual speakers, but we're all here, and Sara Tolbert is having to slip away, and so is Kera in a moment. We won't stay long, but we might get you to answer a first couple of questions. Kate, is there?
There's lots of comments more than questions.
I saw the first question about how do people feel that they sustain their inspiration? And that they found you inspiring. How do you sustain it? Kera, you have more odds than many at the moment. So how do you sustain your sense of inspiration?
Kia ora, ngā mihi mō tēnei pātai. In summary, at the moment, poorly. If we're being completely honest, I think that it can be really difficult for a lot of the issues that have been raised by other panelists as well. You know, hearing Sylvia, your kōrero around student debt and the barriers that having to work while studying and that sort of thing plays. That's a big barrier to activism and has been something that has been a challenge, while I was studying as well. And then also reflecting on some of the kōrero from other panelists as well. I think there is a lot, to be honest, there is a lot that does contribute to burnout, which I would say I probably fit in that category at the moment. And I think a lot of that also particularly comes from just the ways that I think we often are interacting as a, sort of climate movement in Aotearoa at the moment, is I think there is actually quite, it is quite a big group of people, but so often it can be really split or maybe not as connected as would be, I suppose, supportive for our activists. So I guess where I do get, those sort of nuggets of inspiration from, making those sort of connections between different groups within our movement, when we're able to talk on a disability rights kaupapa and talk around how, climate change is affecting our disabled community, and then to see other activists pick that up and go, oh, okay, that's right. Now I'm gonna be taking some action to make sure that my next event is accessible. Like, seeing those little wins, I think, helps a lot. But to be honest, I don't think I would still be in this activism game, probably 15 years later without having taken some significant time out. I have had times where I've just had to take a couple of years off and focus on doing other things. And when I have been able to, I think do my best activism has been when I've had a lot of support, to be honest, from my whānau, from my partner, and from an amazing kick-ass group of wahine who I'm very privileged to call my friends, who are all doing amazing world-changing things in their own ways. And when I get to kōrero and wānanga with them and talk about, this existential crisis that I'm having and climate change and all of these big sorts of things, you know, they're always reminding me of how that's connected back to, you know, to my whakapapa, how, you know, they're able to ground it in our own tikanga, our own cultural sort of practices. And I think that's where I maybe draw, maybe not inspiration as such, but strength from, is definitely from those sorts of relationships and being in good relationship with, you know, my loved ones and other people in our community and other people who are ultimately trying to do something, you know, for the planet and for social justice as well. So I think that's probably where the strength comes from.
Thank you. And Maya or Sara Tolbert or Sara Thomson, I see that there's a question: how do we open up these conversations to wider groups? Kera's probably answered some of that, but Maya, you know, there's a big difference, and you will have seen it, between the school strikes on the ground where people were interacting in real time, and then this online COVID period where we're more siloed. What's your thinking about how to open that up a bit, or what's been your experience of the shift?
I mean, obviously it's been very difficult to have any events during COVID, because the sort of idea behind the strikes was the disruption and the break from the norm. So I suppose with the question of how do you incorporate other ideas and get them involved, I've always found that no matter what, someone can always do something to help. That's, I think, why I guess I am so passionate about this cause, is because there's always been a way for someone to do something. Like if they're an artist, they got on board by directing that. Or for me, like I was a writer and I loved writing poetry and I loved writing opinion pieces, and that's how I channeled my efforts and did my activism, which is why partially I don't really like that term, because it's sort of very categorical, but really there are so many people who are activists even if they don't fit the mold, I guess. So I've always found that sort of expressing that and sharing the way that I see that and talking to people about what they can actually do and how they fit in. An example is sort of like businesses and cafes, like in Christchurch, there are quite a few cafes and businesses that want to be more climate friendly and want to be involved but don't really know how. And so just sort of sitting and saying, well, look, like there's a role for everyone, and there's a part that you can play in this whole narrative of climate change. So yeah, you can get involved in whatever way you feel strongest.
Just before we close, I know there are people that are logging on from around the world at the moment, and one of the questions here is from New Zealand, but it's been asked in an email as well from international people. So Sara, from an education point of view, thinking about your experiences in both the US and New Zealand and other countries as well, what does it take to shift a curriculum to include more sustainability and citizenship and civic and climate change in the actual debates? They're very different experiences between the US and New Zealand, but what's your thinking about what it would take to actually open this conversation more?
Oh gosh, well, I think, and this falls, I think Jordan had a question that relates to this as well, right? About how do we bring sustainability and citizenship and environmental justice into the curriculum when we know that might be resistance or cynicism. I think there are a lot of different ways. I think that's part of my responsibility as a teacher educator, as I see myself. You know, it's a big role to play with pre-service teachers and teachers coming into the profession, that this is how we teach in this context, right? So this is just how things are done now, and that they need incredible support to be able to learn how to do that well. And so we're always thinking and reflecting and engaging in our own praxis to learn how to do that better for novice teachers who are grappling with so much as they come into the profession. But I do also feel that there is a lot of hope there. And I also feel that there are committed teachers, and who aren't novice teachers, who have been doing this work for a while, and for them, I think it's about connecting with others who are also engaged in that same struggle and bringing those teachers together in a network. And I think that can be really, really powerful. And I've seen that be very powerful, particularly in the US context, where teachers can feel so isolated in that struggle sometimes. But also here, I think that matters a lot. So it is that, sort of building a collective and building solidarity where you can find it. And Jocelyn, you probably can speak to that as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I was putting my hand up there, going, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's some really good work being done for teacher education, but for teachers already in the classroom, they need support. And we try and provide it through our New Zealand Association for Environmental Education, but not all teachers know that that exists, because we're not a teacher association like, say, Geography Teachers Association. One of the things in the early days, in the early 2000s, the Green Party won an agreement with the Labour Party back in 99 or 98 or whatever, to provide education for sustainability advisors that would be able to go into schools. We saw a big drop off of schools actually, for secondary schools, actually bringing in education for sustainability once those advisors were dropped in 2009 by, to be political, by the National Party. And so a lot of teachers were coming to people like myself working within the regional council, asking for that kind of support. So support is really important for teachers who are in the classroom already, because there's a lot of reading to do, and there's a lot of angst about, well, I don't know enough, and that's okay to not know enough. It's about learning with your young people, because there's a lot that we do know that's coming at us, but there's a heck of a lot we don't know. And so that's where it's useful to have advisors to give teachers the boost that it's okay to not know the answers.
Yes, and I think that's probably a really good point at which to finish our discussion, because that I would like to note and thank some of the international parents groups who have also been messaging, both the local within New Zealand and outside internationally, because this is a question of intergenerational solidarity and fairness as well. To get the far-reaching transformation that we need, we can't leave it to another cohort. Within our lifetimes, these issues are not going to be solved. As Professor Bollard says, the wonderful work in environmental racism and justice, this is not just a marathon. This is a relay marathon of passing the baton through generations. And every generation needs to learn and fight and work on these issues to get transformational change. And it's been hugely rewarding for me to be able to work. And I really would like to thank the panelists that you've heard tonight for the rich conversation and the rich additions that they've made to the ideas and this second edition of the book. There are some other big thank yous too, which are to three of our contributing authors who can't be with us tonight, Raven Cretney, Amelia Woods and Amanda Thomas, to our publishers Routledge, to our supporters, both the University of Canterbury, but also the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity in the UK, to our wonderful endorsers, and also to the forward writer, Tim Jackson, who's the director of CUSP, and to Roger Hart from New York's Children's Research Group. We're really grateful for their input and for the support of our cycles, our children and young people in cities study, which is part of CUSP. So it's been a marvellous collective project of collective action. I hope it's useful. I'm incredibly grateful to colleagues, writers and readers, and together we can achieve extraordinary change. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Kia ora.